I was standing in my kitchen, the kitchen I'd renovated myself 3 years ago, when my girlfriend looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you actually loved me, you'd add my name to the $750,000 house deed." And I knew right then that everything I'd built was about to be tested. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start with manipulation. It starts with a lesson my dad taught me when I was 19 years old and just got my electrician's apprentice license. My father was an electrician for 32 years, worked on everything from residential rewiring to commercial high-rises. And the one thing he drilled into my head wasn't about voltage or circuit breakers, it was about protection. He told me one night after a 12-hour shift that the most important thing a man can do is protect what he builds, not just with insurance or contracts, but with documentation, boundaries, and smart decisions. He showed me his filing cabinet full of permits, receipts, photos of every major job, every license renewal, every piece of paper that proved he'd earned what he had. I didn't fully understand it back then, but I do now. I'm Ethan, I'm 34, and I've been working as an electrician since I was 19 years old. I started as an apprentice making $12 an hour, pulling wire through attics in 100-degree heat, learning the trade from guys who'd been doing it since before I was born. I got my journeyman license at 23, my master electrician license at 27, and by the time I turned 30, I'd saved enough to start my own electrical contracting business. It wasn't luck, it wasn't a handout, it was 6 years of living in a cramped apartment, driving a 15-year-old truck, and putting every extra dollar into my business account. Now I've got 8 guys working for me, including my foreman Mike, who's been with me since day one, steady contracts with 3 property management companies, and a reputation that keeps my phone ringing even during slow seasons. 6 years ago, when I was 28, I bought my house. It was a 3-bedroom ranch-style place in a decent neighborhood, needed some work but had good bones, and I got it for $420,000. I put down $84,000, which was every penny I'd saved, and I spent the next 2 years fixing it up myself. I rewired half the house to code, updated the breaker panel, installed new lighting fixtures in every room, refinished the hardwood floors, painted inside and out, and landscaped the front yard. Every single upgrade, every permit, every receipt, I kept in a folder just like my dad taught me. The house appraised last year at $750,000, which means I'd built $330,000 in equity through my own sweat and smart investing. That house wasn't just property, it was proof that I knew what I was doing with my life. I met Valerie about 2.5 years ago at a birthday party for a mutual friend. She was 29, worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, drove a leased BMW, and had that kind of confidence that makes you pay attention when she walks into a room. We hit it off, started dating, and for the first 6 months, everything seemed normal. She had her own apartment across town, a 1-bedroom place she rented for about $1,400 a month, and we'd split time between her place and mine. But slowly, almost without me noticing, she started spending more nights at my house. First it was weekends, then it was 3 or 4 nights a week. Then she started leaving clothes in my closet, toiletries in my bathroom, food in my fridge. I didn't mind at first because I liked having her around, and honestly, my house had more space and was in a better neighborhood than her apartment. About 8 months into the relationship, she mentioned that her lease was coming up for renewal and the landlord was raising her rent to $1,650 a month. She didn't ask to move in directly. She just kind of sighed and said, "I hate throwing away money on rent when I'm basically living at your place anyway." And I made the mistake of saying she could stay at my house while she figured things out. That was the first red flag I missed. She never signed a lease, never paid rent, never contributed to the mortgage or property taxes. She'd buy groceries sometimes, sure, and she paid for dinners out, but there was never a formal arrangement about her living in my house. Looking back, I should have set boundaries right then, should have either asked her to contribute financially or kept it casual, but I didn't because I thought we were building something together. Then she met Ashley. Ashley was this friend Valerie made at some networking event for pharmaceutical reps, and from the moment Ashley entered the picture, things started shifting. Ashley was the kind of person who had opinions about everyone's relationship, always talking about what her boyfriend did for her, what her friends' boyfriends should be doing, what expectations were reasonable in modern relationships. Valerie started coming home from lunches with Ashley and casually dropping comments like, "Ashley's boyfriend just added her to his condo title because he wanted her to feel secure," or, "Did you know in some states, if you live together long enough, you're basically entitled to half of everything?" I'd laugh it off or change the subject, but the comments kept coming. She started sending me articles about cohabitation rights, about how couples who live together should share assets, about what it means to be a true partner. I'd read them, nod, and move on because I figured she was just thinking out loud. But then one night about 4 months ago, we were sitting at the dinner table after I'd made grilled chicken and vegetables, and she brought it up directly. She said, "I've been thinking, we've been together for over 2 years now. I live here, we're building a life together, and it feels weird that this house is only in your name." I put my fork down and asked her what she meant. She said, "I think you should add me to the deed. Make me a co-owner, so it actually feels like our home and not just your house that I'm staying in." I stayed calm, which I'm proud of, and I explained the situation logically. I told her I bought this house 6 years ago, for years before we even met, with my own money that I'd saved for years. I explained that I'd put in sweat equity, that I'd done most of the renovations myself, that the increase in value was because of my work and my investment. I said I cared about her. I loved having her here, but adding her to the deed would mean giving her legal ownership of an asset she hadn't contributed to, and that didn't make sense to me. She didn't yell, but her face changed, got cold, and she said, "So you're saying you don't see a future with me?" I told her that wasn't what I was saying at all. I was just being realistic about property and finances. Then she hit me with the line I'll never forget. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "If you actually loved me, you'd add my name to the $750,000 house deed." And the way she said it, with that entitled tone, like my hard work was somehow conditional on proving my feelings, made something click in my brain. I looked at her and realized this wasn't about love. This was about control and ownership of something she hadn't earned. I told her no, I wasn't adding her to the deed, and if that was a problem for her, we needed to talk about what this relationship actually was. She stood up from the table, grabbed her purse, and said, "I need to think about whether I want a future with someone who doesn't treat me like an equal partner," and walked out the door. She didn't come back that night, didn't answer my texts, and I sat in my house wondering if I'd just dodged a bullet or lost someone I cared about. Valerie came back 3 days later like nothing had happened, but everything had changed. She didn't apologize, didn't explain where she'd been, just walked in with her key, unpacked her overnight bag, and started acting like we were roommates instead of a couple. The warmth was gone, replaced by this cold, transactional energy that made my own house feel uncomfortable. She stopped cooking, stopped asking about my day, stopped doing any of the little things that made it feel like we were building something together. When I'd come home after a 10-hour day running wire through a commercial building downtown, she'd be on the couch scrolling her phone, wouldn't even look up. I'd ask if she wanted to grab dinner, and she'd say, "I already ate," in this clipped tone that made it clear she wasn't interested in spending time with me. The worst part was how she started weaponizing the house itself. She'd make comments like, "I'm just staying in your house, so I guess I should act like a guest," or "It's your property, you make the rules," with this passive-aggressive edge that was clearly meant to make me feel guilty. I'd ignore it, focus on work, try to give her space to process whatever she was dealing with, but it became obvious pretty quickly that this wasn't about processing, this was about punishment. She was punishing me for not giving her what she wanted, and I started wondering if I even knew who this person was. About 2 weeks after she came back, I started noticing she was texting more than usual. She'd be smiling at her phone, typing long messages, and when I'd walk into the room, she'd tilt the screen away or put it face down on the table. I'm not the jealous type, never have been, but something felt off. She started going out more, saying she had worked dinners or was meeting Ashley, coming home at 10 or 11 at night smelling like wine, and making excuses about traffic or long meetings. I didn't confront her because I didn't have proof of anything, and honestly, part of me thought maybe she was just creating distance because we were going through a rough patch. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything came crashing down. I was supposed to be at a job site in the north part of town until 6, but the project got delayed because the building inspector didn't show up, so Mike told the crew to pack it up early. I got home around 3:30, which was unusual for me, and I immediately noticed Valerie's car in the driveway, which was also weird because she was supposed to be working. I walked up to the front door, unlocked it quietly because I wasn't trying to sneak around, I just didn't think to announce myself. The moment I stepped inside, I heard voices coming from upstairs, from my bedroom, and one of them was definitely male. I stood in the entryway for maybe 5 seconds, just processing what I was hearing, and then I walked upstairs. I didn't run, didn't yell, just walked up slowly while my brain tried to catch up with what was happening. I pushed open the bedroom door, my bedroom door, in the house I'd bought with my own money, and there she was in my bed with some guy I'd never seen before. They both froze, she screamed. He scrambled for his clothes. and I just stood there feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. The guy grabbed his pants and shirt and practically ran past me down the stairs, didn't say a word, didn't even look at me, just bolted out the front door like the house was on fire. Valerie pulled the sheet up around herself, and I waited for her to say something, anything that made sense, but instead she went on the offensive. She said, "Maybe if you treated me like an actual partner instead of a tenant, I wouldn't have to look for affection somewhere else." And I swear I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her to get out, and she had the nerve to laugh, actually laugh, and say, "This is my home too. You can't just kick me out." I walked over to the closet, pulled out her suitcase, threw it on the bed, and told her she had 30 minutes to pack whatever she could carry because I was changing the locks tonight. She tried the guilt trip first, saying I was overreacting, that it didn't mean anything, that she'd made a mistake because she felt insecure about our relationship. When that didn't work, she switched to anger, yelling that she had rights, that she'd been living here for over a year, that I couldn't just throw her out without notice. I stayed calm, which seemed to make her even angrier, and I explained very clearly that she'd never signed a lease, never paid rent, never contributed to the mortgage or property taxes, and legally, she was a guest in my home, not a tenant. She screamed that she'd call the police, and I told her to go ahead because I had nothing to hide. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she packed 2 suitcases, the whole time muttering about how I was controlling and cold, and that she should have known better than to waste 2 years with someone like me. I didn't engage, didn't argue, just watched her pack and waited by the door. Before she left, she turned around and said, "You haven't heard the last of this. I have rights to this house whether you like it or not," and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. The moment she was gone, I called my buddy Ryan, who's a contractor I've worked with for years, and I told him what happened. He came over within an hour with a new deadbolt and handle set, and we changed every lock on every door. I took photos of the house, documented that all her belongings were gone except for a few random items she'd left behind, and I put those items in a box by the garage. I texted her that her remaining stuff was available for pickup and that she needed to arrange a time with me to get it. No random showing up. She didn't respond. For about 2 weeks, I thought that was the end of it, that she'd moved on and I could start rebuilding my life. Then I got a letter in the mail from a law office downtown, one of those thick envelopes with a firm's name embossed on the return address. I opened it and read the first line, which said Valerie was claiming she had an ownership interest in my property due to our cohabitation and her contributions to the household. I read it 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was actually trying to claim part of my house, the house I'd bought 4 years before I even met her, the house I'd renovated with my own hands and money. I immediately called the lawyer my dad had used for his business stuff, a guy named Carter who'd been practicing real estate and contract law for 25 years. I sent him the letter, all my documentation about the house purchase, renovation receipts, permits, photos, everything. He reviewed it all and called me back the next day. He told me not to worry, that I was in a very strong position, that my state doesn't recognize common law marriage, and that Valerie's claim had almost no legal basis. He said she'd have to prove she contributed financially to the property or that we had some kind of explicit agreement about ownership, and since she couldn't prove either of those things, her case was essentially dead in the water. But he also warned me that she could still drag this out, file a nuisance lawsuit, and cost me time and money even if she had no real chance of winning. I authorized him to respond to her lawyer, and he sent back a letter that basically said, "Bring it on. We have all the documentation, and you're wasting everyone's time." I figured that would be the end of it, that her lawyer would see the reality of the situation and advise her to drop it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, Carter called me and said she's filing a civil suit. She's asking for $50,000 as compensation for her contributions to the household and emotional damages, and I felt my blood pressure spike for the first time in this whole mess. The civil suit took 4 months to wind its way through the system, for months of paperwork and depositions and stress that I didn't need while trying to run a business. Carter kept reassuring me that we had an airtight case, but the anxiety of having someone try to take what you've built, even when you know they're wrong, that eats at you in ways I wasn't prepared for. Valerie's lawyer was clearly working on contingency, probably promised a cut if they won, and they were throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. They claimed she'd contributed to household expenses, which was partially true in the sense that she bought groceries sometimes, but they couldn't provide receipts or bank statements showing any significant financial contribution. They claimed she'd done unpaid domestic labor that increased the property value, which was absurd because I'd done all the actual renovation work myself and had the permits to prove it. They even tried to argue that our relationship constituted a domestic partnership under state law. But Carter shot that down immediately because my state requires explicit registration for domestic partnerships, and we'd never filed anything. The whole thing felt like watching someone try to build a house without a foundation, just stacking lies and half-truths and hoping it wouldn't collapse. The court date finally came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. I showed up in a suit with Carter, carrying a cardboard file box full of documentation that we probably didn't even need, but brought anyway, just to make a point. Valerie was there with her lawyer, wearing a black dress like she was going to a funeral, and she wouldn't even look at me. The hearing lasted maybe 45 minutes. Carter presented our evidence, the purchase documents showing I'd bought the house 4 years before we met, the renovation receipts all in my name, the mortgage statements showing I'd been the sole payer for 6 years, the lack of any lease or cohabitation agreement, the photographs timestamped before and after renovations. Valerie's lawyer tried to argue emotional investment and contribution to household management, but the judge cut him off halfway through and said, "Counselor, I've reviewed the filings and I don't see any legal basis for your client's claim to property ownership or compensation." The judge dismissed the case right there, didn't even need to deliberate, and then came the part that actually felt like justice. Carter had filed a motion for me to recover legal fees since the suit was frivolous, and the judge agreed. Valerie was ordered to pay $4,500 to cover my attorney costs, and the look on her face when the judge announced that was something I'll never forget, just pure shock that her plan had backfired that badly. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping out of a fog I'd been living in for months. Carter shook my hand, told me to focus on moving forward, and said if she tried anything else to call him immediately. I went back to work that afternoon, showed up at a job site where we were installing a new electrical panel for a small office building, and just threw myself into the physical work because I needed to feel normal again. But Valerie wasn't done trying to control the narrative. Within a week of the court ruling, she started posting on social media about how she'd been used and discarded, how she'd invested years into a relationship with someone who saw her as disposable, how she'd learned that some people only care about money and property. She never mentioned the lawsuit, never mentioned the cheating, just played the victim to anyone who'd listen. I didn't respond at first because I figured people who knew me would know the truth, but then friends started sending me screenshots of her posts, and I realized she was doing actual damage to my reputation. So I made one post, just one, laying out the facts in the most neutral way possible. I explained that I'd bought my house years before we met, that she'd lived there without contributing to the mortgage or ownership, that the relationship ended when I discovered infidelity, and that she'd filed a frivolous lawsuit that was dismissed by a judge with her being ordered to pay my legal fees. I didn't editorialize, didn't call her names, just stated the timeline and the facts. The response was overwhelming. People I hadn't talked to in years reached out to say they'd suspected she was manipulating the story, mutual friends apologized for believing her version, and her whole victim narrative fell apart within 48 hours. The karma didn't stop there. Through mutual connections, I found out more about the guy I'd caught her with. His name was Trevor. He worked with Valerie at the same pharmaceutical company, and it turned out he was married. His wife somehow found out about the affair, I'm guessing through someone at their workplace, and she filed for divorce within a month of everything going down. So Valerie's little escape plan had blown up in spectacular fashion because Trevor wasn't leaving his wife for her. He was getting divorced because of her. I also heard that Valerie had to move back in with her parents after the lawsuit because she'd been spending money she didn't have on lawyers and lifestyle expenses. And the $4,500 judgment definitely didn't help her financial situation. Ashley, her friend who'd encouraged all the entitlement in the first place, apparently distanced herself once the lawsuit failed because she didn't want to be associated with someone who'd publicly lost that badly. I didn't take pleasure in any of that exactly, but I won't lie and say it didn't feel like the universe was correcting itself. Meanwhile, my business kept growing because the drama hadn't touched my professional reputation at all. I landed 2 major contracts in December, one for a new apartment complex and another for a retail renovation, hired a 9th employee, and my accountant told me I'd had the best year financially since starting the company. The house felt peaceful again, like the energy had shifted back to something calm and positive. About 6 months after everything settled, I met Lauren at a Chamber of Commerce networking event that I normally wouldn't have gone to, but Ryan dragged me along. She was a civil engineer, owned her own consulting firm, and we got talking about the challenges of running a small business in a competitive market. She mentioned she'd bought her own condo 3 years ago and had just finished paying off the renovation costs, and something about the way she talked about property ownership, with pride but not entitlement, made me pay attention. We exchanged numbers, started getting coffee, and the difference between her and Valerie was like night and day. Lauren never asked about my house, never hinted that she expected access to my assets, never played games or tried to manipulate me into proving my feelings with financial gestures. When I eventually told her the whole story about Valerie, she just shook her head and said, "Some people see relationships as partnerships, and some see them as opportunities. You just have to know which one you're dealing with." One night about 3 months into dating Lauren, I was having dinner with my dad, and I told him everything that had happened, the whole saga from start to finish. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "Protecting your assets doesn't mean protecting yourself from happiness. It just means being smart about who you let into your life." And I realized that was the lesson I'd needed to learn. I'm still living in my house, the house I built, and it's still just in my name, but now it feels like a foundation for something real instead of a target for someone else's greed. Some nights I sit on the back deck I renovated 2 years ago, looking at the yard I landscaped, and I think about how close I came to losing it all to someone who never valued what it took to build it. The quiet is nice, the peace is better, and knowing I made the right call every step of the way, that's worth more than any relationship built on manipulation could ever be. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.